my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did.
Well, I haven't analysed their DNA themselves. As far as we're aware from their family tree, we did another quick analysis.
The Spencer name was the gold standard of British blue blood for centuries, a lineage more English than the royals themselves. But tucked within Princess Diana's genetic code lay a 200-year-old secret that a vial of saliva finally whispered to the world. She wasn't just the quintessential English rose, she was a bridge to the East. Scientific tracing has uncovered a strange maternal link to India, proving the people's princess carried a heritage the establishment tried to erase. What was found is absolutely unusual. The science of the mother line. Think of your DNA as a massive, chaotic library. Most of the books are a frantic mashup of your parents' stories. A page from your father's height, a chapter from your mother's eye color, all shuffled together until the original narrative is nearly impossible to track. But in a quiet, dusty corner of every cell, there is one tiny volume that remains untouched by the hands of men. This is the mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Unlike the rest of your genetic makeup, which acts like a blender, mtDNA is a biological heirloom passed exclusively from mother to child, virtually unchanged for thousands of years. It is a genetic time machine that only travels one way, backward through the feminine. For Princess Diana, the most photographed woman of the 20th century, her public image was defined by the Spencer pearls and the English countryside. Yet, science doesn't care about tiaras or titles.
So the first thing we can learn from this term, haplogroup, is group. It's a group, a bunch of people in this case. But what do those people have in common?
To a geneticist, Diana was simply a carrier of a specific haplogroup, a branch on the human family tree defined by specific mutations. When researchers from Britain's DNA sought to map her maternal ancestry, they didn't look at her famous blue eyes or her iconic blonde hair. Instead, they looked for a signature in the mitochondria of her living relatives, specifically her aunt, Mary Roach, and her distant cousins. They were hunting for the R30b haplogroup, a sequence of nucleotides that acts as a GPS coordinate for an ancestor who lived long before the Spencers were even a footnote in history. The beauty of this mother line is its brutal honesty. While a family tree on paper can be scrubbed clean by a nervous social climber or a royal biographer with a reputation to protect, the blood does not lie. If a woman from a different continent enters the lineage, her biological signature stays there, vibrating silently through the generations like a bell that never stops ringing. It skips the fathers entirely. A man can carry his mother's mtDNA, but he cannot pass it to his children. This makes the maternal line a fragile yet indestructible thread. In Diana's case, that thread was pulled tight across 2 centuries, leading away from the damp stone of Althorpe and toward the sun-drenched ports of the East. By sequencing this DNA, scientists weren't just looking at biology. They were performing a forensic audit of a legend. They were looking for the Eve of the Spencer line. Most European aristocrats fall into common Western haplogroups, clusters that suggest ancestors from the steppes of Russia or the forests of Germany. But as the technicians ran the sequences for the Spencer maternal line, the digital readouts began to flicker with something unexpected. The markers weren't lining up with the typical Anglo-Saxon profile. They were glowing with the distinct, unmistakable heat of the Indian subcontinent. But the lab results didn't point to London or Edinburgh. The big question? Where, then? The Indian descent. The history books of the British Raj are often written in the ink of conquest and commerce, but the DNA of the Spencer line was written in the sweat and dust of a 19th century port. To find the source of Princess Diana's bizarre genetic signature, we have to leave behind the manicured lawns of Althorpe and the chilly corridors of Kensington Palace. We have to travel back to 1812 to the sweltering, vibrant heat of Gujarat, India. Here, the air smells of sea salt, turmeric, and the heavy ambition of the East India Company. This is where we find Theodore Forbes, a young Scottish merchant with a wandering eye and a pedigree that would one day lead to the most famous woman on earth. But more importantly, this is where we find Eliza Kewark. For generations, The official Spencer family tree treated Eliza like a footnote written in fading pencil. She was the woman Theodore lived with, the mother of his children, and, according to the polite society of the time, an Armenian. In the rigid racial hierarchy of the British Empire, being Armenian was a convenient label. It was a buffer identity. It suggested a Christian, somewhat Middle Eastern origin that was exotic enough to be tolerated but white enough to keep the family's social standing intact. It was a comfortable lie that allowed the descendants of Theodore Forbes to marry into the highest echelons of the British aristocracy without a second thought. But the DNA results from the R30b haplogroup have finally stripped away that 200-year-old camouflage. Eliza Kewark wasn't just a merchant's companion from the mountains of Armenia. She was an Indian woman.
Eliza Kewark. Now, she was supposed to be Armenian, but she lived somewhere near Bombay. They belonged to this lineage called R30b. Eliza was living in Surat in Gujarat. She was at least part Indian.
A daughter of the soil whose genetic legacy was so profoundly South Asian that it only appears in a tiny fraction of the population today. The story of Eliza and Theodore is not a fairy tale. It is a gritty, complicated narrative of the colonial era. Imagine a young Theodore, far from the mist-covered hills of Scotland, navigating the chaotic markets of Surat. He met Eliza, and by all accounts, they formed a genuine, domestic bond. They had children, including a daughter named Catherine Scott Forbes. In letters home, Theodore spoke of his housekeeper, a common euphemism of the era for a local partner. But as the years passed and the pressures of British respectability began to weigh on him, the distance between his two worlds became an unbridgeable chasm. Theodore eventually sent his children back to Scotland to be raised as proper British subjects, scrubbed of their Indian accents and their mother's culture. Eliza, the woman who gave them life, was left behind in the dust of India. She became a ghost in her own lineage. While her daughter, Catherine, grew up to marry into the Scottish gentry, Eliza's letters to Theodore remained a heartbreaking testament to her erasure. She wrote to him in a script that scholars now recognize as having South Asian influences, pleading for news of her children, begging not to be forgotten. She was the dark-skinned woman in the background of the portrait, the one the painters were instructed to lighten or simply omit. The British establishment had a very specific way of dealing with inconvenient bloodlines. They simply renamed them. By labeling her Armenian, they effectively bleached her out of history, ensuring that when her great-great-great-granddaughter, Diana Frances Spencer, was born in 1961, no one would suspect she carried the biological memory of a Gujarat port. There is a profound, almost cinematic irony in this. Diana spent her life as the ultimate symbol of British grace, yet she was walking through those royal palaces with the mitochondria of a woman the royals would have considered a subject. Eliza's DNA didn't just survive, it thrived. It passed from Eliza to her daughter Catherine, then down through the female line to Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and finally to Diana herself. Every time Diana felt like an outsider in the stiff, cold world of the Windsors, perhaps it was more than just her rebellious spirit. Perhaps it was a cellular connection to a woman who had been discarded by the very same system of class and empire. The bizarre nature of this find isn't just the geography, it's the rarity. The R30b haplogroup is so specific to the Indian subcontinent that finding it in a British aristocrat is like finding a tropical orchid blooming in the middle of a London blizzard. It shouldn't be there, and yet it is the most honest part of her. When the scientists first saw the results, they reportedly checked them twice, then 3 times. They knew they weren't just looking at a mutation, they were looking at the collapse of a myth. The pure British line was a fiction maintained by ink and social pressure, but the blood had kept the receipt. Eliza Kewark, the forgotten housekeeper of Surat, had reached across 2 centuries to claim her place at the very heart of the British crown. She was no longer a footnote, she was the foundation. As we look back at the images of Diana, her warmth, her ease with people from all walks of life, her refusal to be contained, it's impossible not to wonder if Eliza was there all along, whispering through the double helix. The science has finally given Eliza her name back, and in doing so, it has fundamentally changed how we see the most famous family on the planet. The secret in the blood was never meant to stay secret forever. Was it a convenient lie or a genuine mistake? The paper trail versus the genetic trail. History is often a game of he said, she said, but when the he is a Scottish merchant with a reputation to protect and the she is a woman silenced by colonial borders, the paper trail becomes a labyrinth of half-truths. For decades, the genealogical record of the Spencer family was considered settled. It was a sturdy Anglo-Saxon edifice built on baptismal records and marriage certificates. If you looked at the lineage of Frances Shand Kidd, Diana's mother, you would eventually find the name Eliza Kiwark. But beside her name, in the meticulously kept ledgers of the 19th century, was the descriptor Armenian. It was a tidy, safe label that satisfied the Victorian obsession with racial purity while acknowledging that Theodore Forbes's children weren't quite as pale as their Scottish cousins. The detective work required to challenge this wasn't just a matter of looking at a microscope. It required a cross-referencing of dusty archives with cutting-edge bioinformatics. Historians began to look closer at the letters Theodore Forbes sent home from India. In them, he described Eliza with a complex mix of affection and clinical distance. He called her his housekeeper, a term that carried a heavy double meaning in the era of the East India Company. But it was the letters written by Eliza herself, or dictated by her, that began to crack the facade. The script she used and the way she phrased her pleas for her children suggested someone deeply embedded in the local culture of Gujarat, not a transient Armenian merchant's daughter.
Well, I was actually quite delighted because I had sort of suspected this might be true. Eliza was thought to be Armenian, and I think she might be part Armenian.
Then came the geneticists. Led by Dr. Jim Wilson and the team at Britain's DNA, the researchers knew that paper can be forged and memories can be edited, but mitochondria are honest. They tracked down two of Diana's living maternal relatives, cousins who shared that unbroken line of mothers leading back to Eliza. When the results flashed on the screen, the Armenian theory didn't just stumble, it collapsed. The DNA didn't show the markers typical of the Caucasus or the Middle East. Instead, it revealed the R30b haplogroup. This isn't just a broad Asian marker, it is a genetic fingerprint so rare that it is almost exclusively found in people from the Indian subcontinent. Specifically, it is a lineage that has thrived in India for thousands of years. The bizarre reality began to set in. The paper trail had been a 200-year-old exercise in social rebranding. The term Armenian hadn't been a factual description. It had been a social life jacket. In the 1800s, admitting that a future member of the British landed gentry was half Indian would have been a scandal capable of sinking a family's prospects. By pivoting to Armenian, the Forbes family could claim a connection to an ancient Christian civilization, making Eliza exotic rather than colonized. It was a linguistic sleight of hand that worked perfectly for 2 centuries. The paper trail told the story the world wanted to hear. The genetic trail told the story that actually happened. This collision of ink and blood highlights a fascinating tension in how we record human life. We trust the written word, the official record, because it feels permanent. But the DNA suggests that our bodies are the true archives. Every cell in Princess Diana's body was a living document that contradicted the official Spencer biography. The researchers found that the R30b marker was a perfect match for the South Asian profile, a revelation that turned a private family matter into a global headline. It was the ultimate gotcha moment in the history of genealogy. The transition from the lab back to the library was seamless. Once the DNA pointed to India, historians revisited the Forbes papers with fresh eyes. They found mentions of dark-complexioned relatives that had previously been ignored or explained away. They saw the Armenian label for what it was, a Victorian filter applied to a vibrant Indian reality. This wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was a long overdue correction of a historical record that had intentionally looked the other way. The lab results didn't just find a new ancestor, they rescued Eliza Kiwark from the shadows of a convenient lie and placed her firmly at the root of a royal revolution. The gap between what we are told and what we are is often bridged by a single strand of DNA. For Diana, that bridge was built by a woman in Surat, who likely never imagined her genes would one day sit on the throne of the British Empire. The paper trail had tried to erase the woman, but the genetic trail ensured she would never truly be gone. Suddenly, the face in the mirror at Kensington Palace looked different. Diana, the outsider within. There is a haunting quality to the way we look at old photographs once we know the truth they were trying to hide. We search for a tilt of the head, a specific warmth in the eyes, or a stubborn curve of the jaw that might betray a secret lineage. For Princess Diana, the revelation of her Indian ancestry arrived years after her death, but it provides a poetic, almost eerie retrospective on her life within the House of Windsor. She was always the outsider inside the palace walls, the one who didn't quite fit the rigid, cold mold of the British establishment. While the world saw a quintessential English aristocrat, Diana often spoke of feeling like a visitor in her own life, a woman operating on a frequency that the grey men of the palace simply couldn't tune into. Knowing now that she carried the R30b haplogroup, a genetic signature of the Indian subcontinent, adds a profound layer to her legacy as the People's Princess. Diana was famously tactile in a family that viewed a hug as a breach of protocol. She walked through minefields in Angola, touched the hands of leprosy patients in India, and sat on the beds of dying AIDS patients when the rest of the world looked away with clinical detachment. She possessed an intuitive, soulful empathy that felt un-British to her contemporaries in the 80s. While the Windsors prioritized the stiff upper lip and the preservation of the institution, Diana prioritized the human connection. It is impossible not to wonder if some part of her, buried deep in that mitochondrial mother line, felt the pull of the East. During her solo visit to India in 1992, the image of her sitting alone in front of the Taj Mahal became the defining visual metaphor for her loneliness. At the time, we saw a woman grieving a dying marriage. But in the light of the DNA findings, that image takes on a different weight. She was sitting in the heart of her ancestor Eliza Kewark's homeland, a royal princess who was, biologically, a daughter of that very soil. The irony is staggering. The British Empire had spent centuries trying to categorize and civilize India, yet here was the future Queen of England, unaware that her own blood was a product of the very culture her ancestors had sought to rule. The Spencer family had spent 200 years meticulously curating an image of pure, untainted nobility. They were the guardians of the Althorpe estate, the keepers of the flame. But Diana was the one who broke the fire. She was the rebel who refused to play by the rules of the class system. If the British aristocracy is built on the idea of exclusion, of knowing who belongs and who does not, then Diana's genetic makeup is the ultimate subversion. She was the ultimate insider who was, at her core, a product of the ultimate outsider union. Eliza Kewark, the dark-skinned woman from Surat, was not just a distant relative. She was the source of the very biological engine that powered Diana's heart. This bizarre find also recontextualizes Diana's famous affinity for cultures beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. She famously fell in love with Hasnat Khan, a British-Pakistani heart surgeon, and later Dodi Fayed, an Egyptian film producer. Critics at the time whispered about her unconventional tastes, often using thinly veiled xenophobic language to suggest she was straying too far from her roots. They didn't realize that Diana wasn't straying at all. In a way, she was gravitating toward a world that her DNA already recognized. Her attraction to the vibrant, emotional, and non-Western world wasn't a rebellion against her heritage. It was an unconscious embrace of it. The palace officials who tried so hard to manage Diana were fighting against more than just a headstrong woman. They were fighting against 2 centuries of suppressed history. You can change a name on a marriage certificate from Indian to Armenian, and you can send children across the ocean to be raised as Scots, but you cannot manage the mitochondria. It is the one part of the human experience that is immune to PR spins and royal decrees. Every time Diana broke protocol to show a flash of raw, unfiltered emotion, she was channeling a lineage that the British class system had tried to bleach out of existence. There is a certain justice in the fact that this discovery was made through the female line. History is so often a record of what men built, what men conquered, and what men inherited. But the maternal DNA is a silent, female narrative that runs parallel to the official history. It is a story of survival. Eliza Quark survived being abandoned by Theodore Forbes. She survived the loss of her children to a cold, distant land. And she survived the erasure of her identity. She did this by hiding in the blood of her daughters. She waited 200 years for the world to be ready for the truth. When the scientists finally decoded that R30b marker, they weren't just identifying a haplogroup, they were performing a posthumous coronation of a woman who had been discarded by history. Diana often said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. Perhaps that desire came from a place deeper than she knew. She wasn't just representing a small island in the North Atlantic. She was a biological mosaic of the world the British Empire had touched. She was the bridge. And though she never knew the name Eliza Quark, she lived a life that honored Eliza's struggle. She was the outsider within, who finally forced the world to look at the beauty of a mixed, messy, and authentically global heritage. What would the Queen Mother have thought? The odd reality of royal purity. The concept of royal purity has always been a bit of a high-stakes ghost story, a carefully maintained illusion that the blood flowing through a monarch's veins is somehow distinct from the rest of the world's. For generations, the British crown was the ultimate gatekeeper of this myth, positioning itself as a bastion of European lineage, rooted in the mists of Germanic tribes and the castles of Normandy. But the R30b discovery didn't just add a new branch to the tree, it essentially set the old map on fire. When the DNA confirmed that Princess Diana carried a rare Indian marker, the implications instantly trickled down to the next generation.
And so I suppose the significance of this is that William, who will be king one day, has got DNA from India, the first ever monarch, do you think, to have that?
I would think so, at least in the sort of recent time frame of the last couple of hundred years.
It means that Prince William, the future king, is the first British monarch in history with proven South Asian ancestry. This is where the story shifts from a historical curiosity to a modern revolution. For the House of Windsor, whose identity was inextricably linked to the height of the British Empire, an empire that once considered India its jewel in the crown, the irony is almost too perfect to be real. Queen Victoria was the Empress of India, a title she held with distance and imperial pride, never even setting foot on the subcontinent. Now, her great-great-great-great-grandson will ascend the throne carrying the very DNA of the people her empire once ruled. It is the ultimate genetic long game. The subject has become the sovereign, not through conquest or politics, but through the quiet, unstoppable persistence of the maternal line. The reaction to this news has been a fascinating barometer of how much the world has changed. In the 19th century, this revelation would have been treated as a constitutional crisis, a taint to be scrubbed from the record at all costs. Theodore Forbes certainly thought so. He essentially chose to erase Eliza Quark from the social record to ensure his children could pass in the drawing rooms of Scotland. But today, the response has been one of small delight and quiet celebration. There is a profound sense of justice in seeing the myth of racial purity dismantled by the very science that was once used to justify hierarchy. However, let's be honest, the find is genuinely bizarre when you consider the odds. The R30b haplogroup is so rare that researchers have found it in only a handful of people worldwide, almost all of them living on the Indian subcontinent. To find that exact needle-in-a-haystack signature in the most photographed family in London is a statistical anomaly of epic proportions. It suggests that even in an era of rigid segregation and colonial distance, the world was far more interconnected than the history books like to admit. The walls of the palace were never as thick as the Grey Men believed. For Prince William, this genetic heritage offers a unique bridge to the Commonwealth. He is no longer just a symbolic head of a diverse group of nations. He is, quite literally, a part of them. When he visits Mumbai or Delhi, he isn't just a foreign dignitary observing a culture. He is a descendant coming home. This shifts the energy of the monarchy from one of rule over to one of connection with. It humanizes the crown in a way that no PR campaign ever could. It proves that the British identity is not a static, frozen thing, but a living, breathing mosaic that has been absorbing the world for centuries. The confusing truth is that there is no such thing as a pure bloodline. We are all mixtures, all products of migrations, hidden romances, and erased histories. The Spencers, the Windsors, and the Forbes may have tried to curate their narrative, but the DNA acted as the ultimate whistleblower. By the time Prince William takes his oath, he will be doing so as a representative of a globalized Britain, one that finally acknowledges that its English rose had roots that reached all the way to Gujarat. The ghost of Eliza Kawark won't be standing in the shadows of the coronation. She will be right there, encoded in the DNA of the man wearing the crown. It's a story about more than just genes. It's about the truth coming home. The rose that grew everywhere. In the grand, often silent tapestry of history, the truth has a funny way of surviving. It doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops of Buckingham Palace or carved into the marble of Althorpe to exist. It simply waits. For over 2 centuries, the identity of Eliza Kawark was a secret tucked away in the microscopic folds of a genetic sequence, a bizarre anomaly that eventually rewrote the pedigree of the world's most famous woman. Princess Diana was celebrated as the quintessential English rose, a symbol of British grace that felt as homegrown as the rolling hills of the Spencer estate. But science has pulled back the curtain, revealing that the rose was actually a hybrid, a global bloom with roots reaching deep into the red soil of Gujarat. This discovery does more than just add a bit of spice to a royal biography. It performs a profound act of historical restitution. For too long, the story of the British Empire was told through the lens of those who belonged and those who were merely subjects. By labeling Eliza as Armenian, her descendants weren't just protecting their social standing, they were participating in a collective erasure of an Indian woman's reality. They were saying that her blood was only acceptable if it was renamed. But the R30b haplogroup, that rare, stubborn signature of the East, refused to be colonized. It traveled across oceans, survived the cold Scottish winters, and eventually found its way into the heart of the British establishment, proving that the other was never actually outside the gates. They were already inside. Diana's legacy has always been one of breaking barriers and touching the untouchable. We see now that her intuitive, boundary-crossing empathy wasn't just a personality trait, it was perhaps a cellular resonance with a heritage that had been marginalized and hidden. She spent her life as a bridge between the elite and the everyday person, and now we know she was a biological bridge between the West and the East. She was the woman who brought a touch of the world to a monarchy that had spent centuries trying to keep the world at arm's length. As Prince William prepares to one day lead a modern, diverse Commonwealth, he does so with the knowledge that he is the living embodiment of that diversity. The secret in the blood is no longer a scandal to be managed. It is a badge of connection. It tells us that our stories are never as simple as the names on a family tree. We are all made of the people who were forgotten, the housekeepers and the outsiders whose names were whispered or changed. The story of Princess Diana's DNA is the ultimate reminder that the truth always comes home. Eliza Kawark, the woman from Surat, is no longer a ghost. She is a princess's ancestor, a king's great-great-great-grandmother, and the true source of a lineage that finally reflects the world it represents. The English rose didn't just grow in a garden, it grew everywhere. What do you make of this controversial narrative on Diana's lineage? Leave your comments below and subscribe for more stories in this channel.